The book of Acts has a very bizarre beginning. Jesus disappears into thin air. And you think, well, what kind of a good idea can it be when Jesus gives the disciples their greatest task, which is to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, and then disappear into thin air? No wonder they kept on looking up at the sky, because they were alone with a world to win. And they might have felt a little deserted. And yet it's not desertion, it's design. It's Jesus' way of saying, now you go out and do the impossible things I did. I saw this at work through a Christian lady in China I once met. We called her Auntie Mabel. She was a doctor in Beijing, very well known for her bright Christian witness. But when the communists came to power in 1949, everything changed for her. She was evicted from her large house, and she was forced to live in her garden shed. And because she was well known as a Christian, she was targeted. She was stripped of her doctor's post, and she shoveled sand in a work gang. That's what they asked her to do. And then when the Cultural Revolution got going, the teenagers, the Red Guards, were given power over her, and they came to her, they beat her up, they paraded her in the streets, and they put this large sign outside her house saying no one must speak to her because she has distributed Bibles. And that's not allowed in the new China. That's anti-Mao. And so she was shunned. No one would talk to her. And this was harder for her than being beaten and being put into jail. She said, I descended into hell. And she said, one night I came back, I went into my little kitchen, and she said, I've had enough. I'm an old lady. I've had a good life. God won't mind me coming to heaven early. So she took a large knife and she held it over her wrist, and she said one last prayer before she brought it down. She said, Lord, if this is wrong, help me. Well, she never brought the knife down. She put it away, she burst into tears, and she endured another 8 years of beatings and isolation and victimization. She said, no angel appeared and whipped the knife out of my hand. She said, somehow God gave me the strength to go on, but I never knew how. And she said, all the time, I was always asking Jesus to make an appearance to me. Come to me. Put your arms round me. Why must you be so invisible? She cried. And many years later, she knew why. Because in the late 70s, after Mao had died, China began to put the excesses of the Cultural Revolution behind it, and the Red Guards were disbanded. But Mabel wasn't restored to her house. But even in her little garden shed, she began to receive a stream of visitors. And many of these visitors were very high-ranking members of the Communist Party. She recognized their faces from the newspaper. And even more astonishingly, they all had one question: do you have any Bibles? And she was saying, oh, why are you coming to me out of all the people in Beijing? Why'd you come to my house? And they would say, well, we remember during the Cultural Revolution, there was a large sign outside your house that contained all your crimes. And one of them said that you were guilty of distributing Bibles. I'm just here on the off chance that you might have some left. And so that sign that caused her such misery launched her ministry. It had kept people away from her during the Cultural Revolution, but after she had endured, it drew them. And Mabel was able to contact Open Doors. We smuggled Bibles to her, and she became the first distributor of scriptures in China's capital again. She was a vital supplier. And even today, there are high-ranking members of the Communist Party who owe their faith to her endurance. And she said, well, it's been nice to know why. It helps my faith. But she said, it was hard. Every day was hard. And she said, I never seemed to get that prayer answered of, Lord, please appear for me. But she said, I see that this was for the best, because she said if Jesus had come to me, I wouldn't have done the impossible. He would have overshadowed me. He would have controlled me. But in not being there, he was giving me the space to do the impossible through his power. That's not desertion, she said. It's generosity. You will receive power, he said, after I'm gone up to heaven. That's what he said to the disciples. So the cloud that hides him from our sight is not a disaster. It's design. Sure, the disciples must have felt bereft. But Jesus is really saying, I'll send the Spirit, and we will do all these things together, through each of you, in a new and beautiful way. So we get invited to be his partners, or the theologians say, co-creators. He wants us to do what he did to an even greater degree. Jesus ascends to give us the space to do the impossible for him and through him. Now that means space to fail, space to struggle, space to be unsure. And the characters in the book of Acts, they have their doubts and their disagreements and their struggles. And if Jesus had stayed, there would have been none of that. When they have to decide in Acts 15 in the council, should the Gentiles become Christians or not, or be allowed to become Christians or not, Jesus would just have appeared and told them what to do. But he didn't. He let them struggle. He let them figure it out. Or when Paul was having his disagreement about who to take on a trip with him, and Barnabas and he actually had such a violent disagreement, they went their separate ways. Jesus would have sorted that out. If he'd stayed behind, he would just have said, Paul, take so-and-so. Barnabas, you just deal with it. And yet that didn't happen. They got the power to decide. They got the power to, in a sense, create the will of God and live out the gospel in a much more intimate way. So even our failures, even our difficulties, even our struggles become the means in which God spreads the gospel through us, just like Mabel. That horrible sign outside her house, it was a mark of humiliation. But actually, because she endured in the power of Christ, it was the means of her wonderful ministry. And that's a lady who did that marvelous job for Christ in her 80s. So we're never too old to do a remarkable work for Christ. When Mabel looked back over her life, she can say, I did that. I endured with Christ's help and brought Bibles to Beijing. Mabel thought that terrible notice board was the end of her, and it was in a sense, but only so that God could make another beginning through her. And a cloud still hides Jesus from our eyes for all of us, so that we get the same opportunity to do the impossible in his power. It's a risk. What a plan. But what an opportunity.